So, hello everybody, good morning. Thank you very much for joining us for our recommendation and output session. As you can see, we have a great lineup of groups presenting today, either their definitive or a draft version of their group's outputs. We are, as you know, very happy to have this opportunity to talk to them, to see how the developments of their work is going forward, and maybe have an exchange toward the end of the session with a couple of questions from the audience. So without further ado, I'll ask Peter Baumann from Jacobs University to speak to us about the Array Database Assessment Group. Please.
And that's it. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Timia, for the introduction. I'm trying to get the grips. Green means good to go, so I'm trying my luck. No. Does that need to be switched on? No. Can anybody help me? Back there? Ah, it's coming. Okay. It was just with a delay. Now I have to roll back. Okay, this is actually where we are supposed to start. Long title. Maybe we hold the record, I don't know, with the longest working group title in RDA, Array Database Assessment Working Group. That is led by Kwon Kur and myself, and I'll tell you in a minute what that long title is about. So, actually, whenever we collect data, very often these get into some raster. Spatial resolution, like satellite images, but also temporal resolution as you gather data over time. Also, simulated data often appear in the same way. So we have something that today often is called a data cube, if you arrange these data, and programmers like to call these arrays, multi-dimensional arrays. And this actually explains it. This is what we want to deal with, because actually they play a key role in science and engineering and beyond, even into business. So that is something that is handled actually in ad hoc solutions most of the time today. We have databases that are used to deal with big data, but unfortunately they do not support that kind of thing, these data cubes. This is where array databases jump in. That's specialized technology that adds in support for such big data cubes. If you ask me what does that mean practically, well, this is typically spatial-temporal sensor data, images, also image time series, simulation data, and also statistics data. So, array databases, in brief, add query capabilities on your data, just as you know them from metadata. Now we want to find out, and we want to present for the benefit of RDA, how does it help, what is the status, and how to deal with them. The central deliverable is on the wiki currently, because that eases editing. Finally, it will be cast into some PDF. And if you want to follow that, you will see that the introduction is done, array standards overview is done. We are collecting technology. Currently, we have 17 tools listed. And anybody who finds his or her tool missing, just edit yourself or let me know. Services that are available, we have them on petascale. So altogether, I would estimate a petabyte of data are available. And the assessment, of course, is the toughest thing that is still under work. And the summary has to be written once the assessment is done. The working group currently has 36 members. And we also had some other impact that was not initially foreseen. Actually, we have contributed to DataCube standards. This is still in flow. So actually, we have been granted an extension until Plenary 11, so stay tuned. Next spring in Berlin, we will have everything cast into the final report. Initial adopters that we have, we find institutes as big as the European Center for Medium-Range Weather Forecast, Plymouth Marine Laboratory, MEO is a company in Italy, National Computational Infrastructure in Australia, and GEOFON, which is a startup which explicitly uses that technology for giving commercial support in precision farming. Okay, come on. So here are a few impressions of front end. Don't you think just because a data cube is behind, it must appear as a data cube on screen? That is just a logical organization where you can do fancy clients at the front end doing analysis in space and time. Also, federations have been built. The picture below in the center is generated from data that sit in Australia and in the UK, and processes there, engines, have teamed up to answer that query and generate that result. The expected impact is an increased uptake. This is very recent technology. Not many people are aware of it, and not many people know how to deal with it. So actually, we want to just create awareness and increase awareness. Also, standardization I mentioned. For example, one standard is SQL MDA, an extension of the SQL query language with multidimensional arrays with data cubes, which is in the final stage of adoption. So I guess that would take too much time to go through. I hope I'm making my point with the other slides as well. Feedback. So this is something that is work in progress, as you sense. So more contributors and more contributions are very much welcome at any time. What we need is 3 types of contributor. Use case providers. You have data and you know what you would like to do with it. Let us know. That is excellent user stories for us. Service providers. Somewhere the services need to run, so we need data centers that are willing to host a couple of data and run services on them. And finally, of course, software providers that help installing the software, establishing everything so that users can play with it. Currently, we have a focus on Earth and space sciences. What we would like to see, for example, is life sciences, so if you feel addressed here, but also cosmological, so astrophysics, for example, would be exciting, or anything else that you come up with. So please let us know if you have some idea on what you would like to do. It's an exciting thing. It's at the forefront of technology. And you would help us bringing that from the forefront of technology to daily use. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Peter. So again, if you have any questions, please wait until the end of the presentations, and we will address them individually. Next to present is Larry Lanham for the Data Type Registries number 2.
Thank you. Good morning. So this is the number 2 because this is the second incarnation of this group. Probably we're partway through that second incarnation, and this will probably be the last incarnation as a traditional working group. The problem is fairly simple to state and fairly broad, which is data sharing. If RDA is in the business of data sharing, effective data sharing requires that the people you share it with understand your data. And this is not a simple thing. So but when Rainer Statska asked the AI guy yesterday about it, there was some misunderstanding. Fortunately, Hans corrected it later, but it's not just about formats. It's what's underneath. If you have a matrix of temperatures, and you even know that's the Celsius and there's lat long and some time, you still don't know whether it's measured at the ground, measured in the air, what kind of instrument measured it, when was the last time that instrument was calibrated. And if you're going to reuse other people's data, it's actually dangerous to reuse it if you don't understand it and you don't know what it is. And it's certainly difficult to put it together with similar data sets. So that's the issue. How do you characterize data sets at a sufficient level of precision that people who don't know you, who aren't in your lab, can reuse them? So our goal was to evaluate and identify those assumptions, give people a way, a framework to do that. In some ways it's precise external documentation. So this is not about technology. So as opposed to the first talk, we're not cutting edge of anything except organizational, understanding and collaboration. So and we certainly aren't going to. We certainly aren't going to identify every possible combination of things. We just provide a framework for doing this. We also, as you pursue this, you begin to run up against ontologies, of course. And so we have to be careful that we don't go down a rat hole in which we try and classify the entire planet. So we're looking for a sweet spot where information easy to record, relatively easy to use, useful to humans and machines. And that's why it's taken us a while. This is not an easy thing to figure out. So we developed a prototype fairly on. It's there. There are a bunch of implementations. We already had the breakout group for the breakout session for this group, and it was the most active projects. We ran out of time actually to talk about all the active projects. So there are lots of people doing this, but we're doing it in a variety of ways, and our struggle now is to bring these together. We have figured out that we need primitives and derived types on top of that, and that we have to rely on many other sources for the primitives. And we started knowing that the registered types have to be assigned identifiers so that when you encounter a type, you can go to a registry with the identifier for the type and get an understanding of what it is. The initial working group, which sort of codified all that without being too precise, was published as one of those 4 initial ICT technical standards. And there's an ISO study group that has taken this up now. So the next year or so will tell if we actually go down the route of an ISO standard, which is possible. Here are some initial adopters. Some of these, all these people have come to RDA. My organization, CNRI, has some projects that are outside of the RDA so far, although I try and bring in economists and financial people that I deal with. So far, they haven't made it here. Impact. So I had to think about this for a while, and I decided to do a best and worst. So the best case scenario is it's an ISO standard, and it works better than MIME types. And whenever someone puts out a data set, they can type it and other people can use it, and it flows seamlessly. Worst case scenario, nothing happens more than has happened already. So if that's the case, I'm still happy we did it. It's been sort of a consciousness raising effort for many people. We have the ICT technical standard. We're fairly happy with where we've gotten to so far, but I hope we can do better. I had a lovely build here that's not going to work. So impact of deliverable. Before, data set's difficult to understand. After, all is made clear. Before, it's hard to search for data. You can't search, the number 27, might yield a lot of data sets, but it's not a very effective search criteria. So typing can add to that. That was my surprise when I started the working group, is I didn't see that as a use case, but in fact, about half the people say that's the use case they're interested in. And finally, we hope that if this does happen, then a lot of don't care decisions about how to assemble data sets would fall into a common pattern. And so they'd be easier to mash up, to put together over time. And feedback, we've gotten a lot of feedback. That's been, and this working group is one of those where this was a project at CNRI that we brought to RDA, and it not only benefited my organization, but we hope benefited RDA. And it seems to me like that's one way to get things going inside RDA. Also means there's a little more money associated with it. More use cases always desirable, and it's being used in other working groups and interest groups, which is good. I've seen this entire plenary as one of RDA maturing, and one of the ways that might evidence itself is connections and interdependencies among the working groups, as you have a growing fabric of things produced. And I think that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that. You've touched on a few of the points that hopefully will also come out in the final part of the discussions, like adoption use cases and the close relationship between the various groups and how synergies can be built. So next, I'm going to ask Chandler to join us here. It's the International Material Resource Registry Working Group.
Good morning. So I'm going to be speaking about the Materials Resource Registries Working Group. I'm Chandler Becker. I am a material scientist working on this project. I'd also like to acknowledge the co-chairs, Laura Bartolo and Jim Warren, and my colleague, Ray Plant, who is an expert in the registry systems. So the bottom line for this project is that we're really trying to make it easier to find and share resources about material science. And we're looking at material science information related to things like organizations, data collections, services such as APIs, informational websites, and software. And we're looking at being able to harvest records that are housed at different institutions and in different instances of registry applications, and to be able to exchange these records in a way that each institution can maintain their own records and keep them current, but they're available to everybody through the Federation. So why are we doing this? Well, material science is a very broad and interdisciplinary field. It primarily comes from metallurgy, ceramics, and polymers, but it also has had a significant contribution from domains such as physics, chemistry, chemical engineering, geology, electronics, optics, biology, and pretty much everybody else in the scientific domain. And so when we talk about trying to exchange data and trying to use each other's data, this can become a really big issue for us. Nonetheless, engineers still need to be able to answer questions like the following. What structural properties and processing methods are required to develop a new lightweight material that can significantly improve fuel efficiency and yet still meet the safety standards that are satisfied by materials that are currently in use? So how do we solve that problem? And for people in the field, we're finding that materials data is really proliferating, which is great, but it can be very difficult and time-consuming to find it and use it. So for this effort, we're really focusing on trying to help users find data-related resources to improve design functions, research functions, and collaboration across different groups. And the way that we're trying to do that is by defining and building consensus around the minimum metadata that's required in order to do material science data discovery. We are working to deploy a metadata schema that is being implemented within a pilot registry that is being developed at NIST. And we are working to validate the material science data collections at various organizations that are participating in the working group. So how well are we doing with our system, with our schema, and with the metadata that we're choosing? So where are we? Okay, so the first version of the schema and the supporting software and the vocabulary are being released. We have basic functionality now that is in place for registering resources, for harvesting records between instances, and for searching. There are deployments of the initial releases at 2 institutions. One is my home institution, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US, and the other is the Center for Hierarchical Materials Design, which is also known as CHIMAD, which is headquartered at Northwestern University and the University of Chicago. We are currently working to populate the system with records and continuing to test both the components and the overall system. So as I mentioned, there are 2 instances currently running. Collectively, they actually now contain more than 260 records between the 2 of them. The first is the NIST registry, which is at materials.registry.nist.gov. And there we're really focused on records related to NIST data holdings, plus a number that are related to the United States Materials Genome Initiative. The second one, as I mentioned, is at CHIMAD, and that's at mrr.materialsdatafacility.org. And they're focusing on records that are associated with their efforts, both through CHIMAD directly and through some collaborations that they have. And the records represent a number of different institutions and types of resources that are relevant for material science. We're also in discussions with several other institutions, so I'll get to the feedback from RDA at the end, but if there are people who are interested in deploying instances of the registry or working with us to register resources, we'd love to hear about it. Outside of the material science domain, the software can be essentially fairly easily repurposed for other applications. And so one example is the International Metrology Resource Registry, hosted at BIPM in Paris, which is a metrology institute. NIST is also a metrology institute. And we are in discussions with several other subcommunities at NIST. So we're looking at taking this basic idea and expanding it out into other domains as appropriate. So what we're working toward is to lay the groundwork to help make materials, resources, and data more readily discoverable, accessible, and interoperable. So the FAIR principles that were discussed yesterday and have been discussed much more broadly. The deliverables also we're looking at going beyond material science. So this project, we're working to provide a model for peer-to-peer federation of registry systems. We're using OAI PMH to exchange the records. We are working to provide a model for interoperable metadata that includes both common non-specific, non-discipline-specific metadata, as well as the discipline-specific part of it. So the material science in this case is the discipline-specific part, and that can be adapted for different purposes. We have a registry application that has support for pluggable metadata, so you can change the domain that's covered fairly easily, as well as a vision for how the registry can contribute to a search process. But in a lot of ways, what we're really trying to do is to support the development of an ecosystem that is around making data and metadata available and machine actionable. And so we can start to talk about other things like, the data type registry and other efforts in order to help with that. And so, for example, one application of this could be in being able to find more data and use it more effectively for machine learning to develop new materials, which is a very active area in the field. So what would we like from the RDA community? Well, if you have suggestions, if you have questions for us, please let us know. But more specifically, are there opportunities for collaboration that we haven't explored fully enough yet, other interest groups or projects? As this effort is maturing, hopefully we'll be able to work more with others. If you know of resources that you think should be registered that would be useful, either things at your own institutions or that you know of more generally, then please also let us know. If there's interest in deploying different instances to participate in this registry federation, we'd love to talk to you, as well as to get feedback on the material science part of it, if that's your area of interest. So our breakout session is tomorrow at 9 o'clock in Cartier 2. And so if you're interested, then we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chandler. Our next recommendation comes from the Data Collection Working Group, and it's one of the recommendations that has sort of reached its definitive stage, so hopefully we will see a version of it published for endorsement very soon.
Thank you, Timea. Okay, so I'm Tobias Weigel. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Research Data Collection Working Group. And just to acknowledge my other co-chairs, Bridget Almas, Frederick Baumgart, and Tom Sastro. And I should also say we had a very active group. We also had multiple contributions and very highly active members. So I'm just also thankful for that, for contributions particularly from Maggie Hellström, Javier Quinteros, and Ulrich Schwartmann. So to start, what was the motivation for research data collections? What was this all about? We perceive that research data management often goes beyond just managing single objects. So the purpose of this group was not just to describe collections of these objects, but also to enable machine actions on them. So that means that we have these commonly known create, read, update, delete actions. We also have list actions plus some others. And we also deal with machine agents as our primary users. This also contributes an essential component to the data fabric group. And then we ended up finally with an API specification. Against, we also think that tools and particular services can be built across community boundaries. So it's all supposed to be very generic, not tied to a specific discipline or solution. Finally, what is the output that we now have? It's threefold. So first of all, we have a collection recommendation document that details the conceptual model, that also explains how we got to this model, what definitions we used. It also tells the stories of adopters and use cases. The second part is the API specification, which we have specified using Swagger OpenAPI. And then we also have reference implementations. All of that is available on GitHub. So it can be used directly on. And we'll also just after this plenary enter the formal RDA outpost process for this. The API was built against key requirements. I'm just listing a few here. These requirements have also undergone change throughout the work of the working group. Just one particular point listed here at the top. We support persistent identifiers, but they ended up not being mandatory. So there is no concern here about having to use this for long-term purposes, for long-term archival. This is not mandatory anymore, which was a bit of discussion in the group. But we said, look, we don't want to prescribe any specific solution here. Other requirements just listed here. There's a more detailed list also in the recommendation document if you're interested in looking at that. Now, just to explain a bit about the high-level conceptual model that we are working with. From the left to right, we start with an identifier for a collection, which can be used to get the essential capabilities, properties, and, of course, the membership of the collection. Capabilities tell you something about what can I really do with this particular instance of a collection. So this definitely is something that is very useful and necessary for machine agents to finally act out on these collections and use the advertised operations that are available. Properties also include something like, can I add to this collection? Is it read-only? Does it have a size limit? Does it contain just members of a particular type? And finally, the membership, of course, contains all the members in a collection. And that also leads then, in the right-hand side, also to more metadata. For example, of course, location of members, a description, possible links to ontologies, data types for individual members, and also what we call mappings. So mappings are a special form of describing metadata that is relevant only in the context of a specific collection instance, such as, for example, the role and an index. So if you have a sorted collection, this would, of course, mean that you use an index. The role of a member can be, for example, it's a particular metadata item or a particular data item that plays a specific role in a specific context of use. Finally, talking a bit about the API structure, we came to a threefold model. So at the top stands the service that any agent can interact with, the service endpoint. Then the service lists multiple collections, which again can have members or other collections as members. So this is also possible doing some sort of recursive collections. Looking in more detail, a service can be asked to understand the features of a service. So can it, what operations does it perform? Is it read-only in total or not? Collections, of course, then the collection level is about these create, read, update, delete, list, understanding capabilities, other operations like that. Members also create, read, update, delete, and list, but also dealing with these particular mappings. Now about the impact. So before, when we started, we saw that there are these incompatible silo approaches to collection management. So nothing is clear about interacting between different repositories or across different disciplines. There was also a missing conceptual framework here, which is also one big part that we developed. So afterwards, we see that, first of all, clients and servers, this distinction can be made, that clients can interact with endpoints independent of specific domains or infrastructures, which can enable a common toolset ecosystem. And for the server side, of course, a repository or another, any kind of storage that offers this can find a balance with basically saying, look, I can offer these common operations that are equal to all of these endpoints, but I can also extend that. So the API in itself just describes these basic operations, but it offers multiple points where you could extend that with your own operations, for example, for further searching, more detailed querying, and so on and so on. Now, talking about reference implementations. So first of all, the GitHub webpage for this group, the group lists also these reference implementations with the source code openly available. We have multiple implementations represented also in different languages here, so many of them are Python-based. We also have, of course, first client that is written in Ruby. There's also a minimal repository software included in the repository called Raptor. You can see the differences here. They are also working against different kinds of backend storages. So if you're interested in looking at that, you will also see that you can adapt. You can adapt these particular implementations also to your existing ecosystem, perhaps. Now, talking about what is going on after this working group, open and future efforts. We see that, and Larry Lerham has already detailed the data type registries recommendation. We see that this should be also used in combination with collections. So there is a first effort included in our recommendation document about describing the types for collection interaction, but this also needs further practical evaluation as part of some test beds. Some first part is done as part of the adoption, but this is definitely something that should see more use and feedback out of practice. The second point is here, Fedora Commons. There is a possible support for the API via the Fedora API X service. That is something that we try to encourage over the last months, and I certainly hope that this will continue. I already mentioned the specification offers extension points, for example, more operations or maturing the conceptual framework. And of course, we desire also beyond this plenary, also for the next plenaries, feedback through the RDA processes. Now I want to talk a bit about adoption efforts. So we've selected 3 particular adoption efforts here that are also linked to specific implementations that I've shown earlier. So this is the GEOFON adoption. It's coming from seismology data. There is a specific case here for dealing with dynamic data. In this case, the implementation also extended our specification with a specific download method for collections and members. So this already goes beyond what the core specification offers. Contact is Javier Quinteros, and you can already see this is a quite heavy use case. Already has a huge number of collections and a huge number of members in them. A second adoption case is Perseids. The contact is Bridget Almas sitting over there. This is about collections of textual and linguistic annotations, where of course one point is that they can be arranged in various forms. Just showing here, you can arrange collections by user, subject, community, review board. So there is multiple ways through which you can slice through this space, and of course the collection specification offers, of course, to cover that. This also is part of this larger effort of dealing with this in a test bed. So this also is its desire to contribute also this together with the PID kernel information and the data type registry output, just to make this a ecosystem that can also be used in combination with those particular recommendations. The third adoption is by EPIC, by the European Persistent Identifier Consortium. There is a collection registry service already implemented, which allows multiple prefix-based registries to interoperate. The backend here is the handler system and the file system behind that for storing the actual members. It's ready to use service to be available now under this URL that's given here. Contract Ulrich Schwartmann is sitting over there. One particular point here is that this very much also deals with the data type registry. So if you want to look at how this interaction actually turns out in practice, then this is definitely something that you could be interested in looking at. Now, I want to thank you all for your attention, and also I want to thank particularly one of my co-chairs, Bridget, who's sitting here, who I've very much enjoyed working with, and I think I'm not the only one saying this here on behalf of others. We will miss you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Tobias, and thank you very much, Bridget. Next to speak is David Wilcox, who will present the recommendations of the research data registries interoperability.
Thank you. Hi. Sure I know how to. So yeah, I'm David Wilcox. My co-chair, Thomas Jekyll, is here as well. We are 12 months into our 18-month effort for the Research Data Repository Interoperability Working Group, so just kind of presenting the sort of interim results so far. So thinking about the problem, you know, I think we all understand interoperability is a really big problem. Even interoperability between repository platforms specifically is a really big problem, and we're certainly not trying to tackle the entire thing. But it was pointed out at the last plenary, our focus is actually a little bit more towards the, rather than interoperability more generally, kind of the exchange of digital content, digital objects between repository platforms. But recognizing that this is quite challenging. There are lots of different data models, different metadata standards, semantics and interfaces. So there's a whole variety of different platforms out there, and they all kind of do things differently. There are a number of current technologies that address at least parts of the problem, but they're typically limited in some respects. So something like OAI PMH, for example, is very widely adopted, but focuses only on metadata. There are also some kind of upcoming approaches that show a lot of promise, but are not necessarily as well adopted as some of these kind of more common approaches. And so we took a look at kind of this current state of the art, but it also with an eye towards addressing particular use cases around things like migration and replication. A few of them are listed here, but looking at, you know, migration of content from a single platform, but between versions where sometimes you have changes in data models or other things that require migrating the data from one version to the next, but also, and this is probably the most significant one, is migration of data between different repository platforms, and then potentially sharing across domains and things like that. So that's sort of what we were looking at in the group. We completed an initial deliverable, which was kind of a primer document on the current state of the art, and that's available. There's a DOI for that, and that really just kind of goes through all of the technologies and standards and protocols that the group could come up with, and tries to just say a little bit about each one and the sort of pros and cons for being able to use it to address our particular use cases. And so that became kind of a foundation for future discussions, but it's a useful document in its own right for just kind of understanding the lay of the land in terms of what technologies and standards could be useful towards this goal of exchange and interoperability. But what we're focused on now, and we're kind of in a draft phase of this, is developing a recommendation. And at the initial outset of the group, we thought about perhaps looking at an API specification. I'll talk a little bit in a minute about why we sort of focused on a slightly different approach. In this case, it's looking at a recommendation towards a standard for interoperability. And we're focused on an approach based on Bagot, which is a specification for packaging content. Of course, Bagot by itself is not sufficient. It's quite an open standard. It allows you to package things in a variety of ways. So in addition to that standard, and as well as kind of mapping to a basic set of metadata while also allowing the inclusion of any additional metadata that might be used at the particular repository. We're also looking at machine-readable profiles. So when you kind of put your content in the bag, you also create or use an available machine-readable profile that basically provides us some more structural information about the contents of that bag. And since those profiles are machine-readable and web-accessible, then there's the potential there for source and destination repositories to be able to share information more easily and understand the contents of these bags by applying the information that's in the profiles. The nice thing about these is that these are all existing technologies and standards that we're trying to incorporate into the work of this group and then sort of add some value to them in a variety of ways. So the profile, for example, that's something that exists but is not widely adopted, and there's no kind of master registry of these profiles and where to find them. So there are things that our group can do, I think, to make this more widely adoptable and usable in the community. So in terms of adopters, we have a pretty broad group. We have a lot of representatives from different repository platforms. A few of them are listed here, and there are some others that we've also brought into discussions, DSpace and Zenodo and a few others that find this approach promising and we're looking at having some adoption amongst these different platform communities. What we want to be able to do by the end of our 18-month effort is demonstrate at least one kind of successful migration of these of content between platforms using this standard. And there's already some tooling that exists. So in the Fedora community, for example, there is already a tool that's capable of handling import, export, and transacting in bags. And some of these other platforms can also already transact in bags. So it's not a really heavy lift. It's adding some additional information and incorporating some of this profile content to make things more interoperable and exchangeable. And in terms of the impact, I think for our group, we were really focused on trying to come up with something that could be achievable within 18 months that was relatively easy to adopt. So this is really why we kind of strayed away from trying to specify an API, because we were thinking about all of the existing platforms that are out there, many of which are kind of legacy platforms or legacy versions of platforms, smaller institutions in particular that can't necessarily do an in-place upgrade. So even if we were to kind of implement something in the core version of software, it's not necessarily true that would trickle down to all of the adopters because they may be running older versions or just don't have the capability of upgrading. So we were sort of focused more on developing a standard that can be implemented in a variety of ways and facilitating that through kind of a sidecar tool or application. So in the Fedora side, that's it's just a command line Java utility, but it could be written really in any language. All it has to do is be able to access information in the source repository, package it in a bag, and then be able to import on the other end from that. So it's mostly just a matter of kind of parsing content. So a variety of ways for implementing that, and something that could be implemented alongside even a legacy platform and still usable. So we thought as an initial effort that would have the broadest impact, and then future efforts can perhaps refine this and start to incorporate other maybe less well adopted or less well known platforms and make this more kind of broadly applicable. So in terms of feedback that we're looking for, I should mention that our group meeting at this plenary is in the next time slot. So obviously I can't say a whole lot more here, but if you're interested in kind of getting more involved with this group, you have the opportunity to do that next in our next time slot here. We are, obviously 12 months in, we're not looking to completely change direction, but we do want some more feedback in terms of the applicability of this kind of approach for if you happen to be a platform developer, if this is something that would work for you, if you see kind of challenges and obstacles. And we have been bringing in representatives to kind of talk about this at our calls, trying to understand what are the barriers to this kind of implementation, and is this something that you would want to adopt in your particular platform? And from users, similar questions. Is this an approach that would be beneficial? And are there things that you think are missing from this approach that could potentially be incorporated, particularly within the next 6 months as we try to bring the draft to a complete recommendation. And finally, I just wanted to mention, in terms of how this group kind of operates, if you do want to get involved over the next 6 months, we tend to use Google Docs for kind of collaborating on this writing, which has been quite beneficial. We have up until now been running bi-weekly meetings, which are quite well attended, trying to get to this draft phase. We're going to reevaluate after this plenary how often we need to meet over the next 6 months, but we tend to meet every few weeks via conference call. There is a group mailing list, and then we also set up a Slack team for quick communication, which has been beneficial as well. So if you do want to get involved, lots of ways to do that, and I'd recommend just coming to the session next if you'd like to do so. But that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, David. Whoever is interested, their initial primer is available on the RDA website under the recommendations and outputs section for supporting outputs. So check it out. And thank you. Anne is going to present our final recommendation. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Good morning. So my name is Anne, and I'm going to speak to you about the progress made in our working group, which is the RDA TADWIG Metadata Standards for Attribution of Physical and Digital Collection Stewardship. So this is a collaborative working group between RDA and another organization called TADWIG, TDWG. This is an organization that promotes the development and maintenance of standards in biodiversity, and they actually provided some funding to bring 2 people to this meeting, and we had our session yesterday. It was a very productive working session. And before I leave this slide, I would like to recognize my co-chairs, Matt Woodburn and Dimitris Kurias, who are both here today. So in summary, the problem that we are trying to solve is basically that curators cannot get credit for their curation activities. And my co-chairs and I all come from the biodiversity space. So physical and digital collections are very important for our research. Now, keeping in mind, we do want our recommendations to be broadly applicable outside of the biodiversity space. But research collections are very important, and part of the problem, curators can't get credit for maintaining these very important resources. So the impact, the result of that is that collections tend to be under-curated. Curators are not able to prioritize those tasks. In addition, we lose a lot of object provenance, and also actions may be unnecessarily repeated because no one knows what sort of curatorial or maintenance actions have been performed on various specimens. So we are almost at our 12-month mark. So we have a few of our deliverables completed. We have our use cases, which go across domains, are finished. We did those in collaboration with various members of our working group here at RDA plenary sessions. And we investigated existing schemas and infrastructures. We, of course, do not want to reinvent any wheels, and we want to use what's already out there as much as possible. So those 2 things are done, and you can view those. We have a Google folder for the working group that can be accessed through the web, the RDA webpage. What we have in progress is evaluating the applicability of those existing schemas and performing gap analysis. And that's a lot of what we did yesterday, actually. We have a lovely diagram showing the landscape of existing schemas, how they overlap, how they fit together, and where we would fit in there. Instead of showing you an impossible to read diagram on this screen, I would invite you to go into the Google folder and view it on your own screen close to your face where you can actually read it. So that's in progress. We are working on going through the use cases and developing the filling the gaps and figuring out exactly how these schemas would be applied in these various situations. And so the very last deliverable would be just the draft schema and the draft metadata standard document. So we need to have a review of those things based on the use cases and get feedback. Of course, we need the final document, and then we need to start liaising with our stakeholders and our adopters to get things actually implemented. And last but not least, we will take the process forward in TADWIG. So there's also a sister group in TADWIG working on the same thing. So once we finish the work within RDA, we will be in a good position to then take up more of the work within TADWIG, and actually the next meeting is going to be in 2 weeks in Ottawa, so we anticipate getting even more work done at the TADWIG meeting. So the initial adopters, of course, is TADWIG. We would like to start the process of perhaps implementing some sort of a Darwin Core extension. Again, the meeting is in 2 weeks. We are also adding to existing ontologies, Prov and Vivo, and these ontologies have their own users across disciplines. And so that would make it open, make our recommendations usable by their users. And of course, there are other controlled vocabularies like credit, and there's also Tadira that we can add terms to. And so our work with Prov and Vivo would basically be adding necessary classes to those ontologies. So the impact of our deliverables that we anticipate is that we'll get improved recognition for the immense effort required to maintain, curate, and share collections, which would likely lead to increased attention and increased funds for these activities, which is the goal. We'll have increased efficiency and knowledge generation from the collections through proper documentation of corrections and analyses performed. We'll have increased viability of crowdsourcing as a model for building collaborative research resources. And again, we'll have an increased relevance of existing infrastructure that is being stifled by the expert annotation bottleneck. So before our deliverables, curation history is either undocumented or not digital. After, we imagine that curation history can be easily found and queried. Before, curators can only do curation tasks in the margins of their time. After, we anticipate that curators will be able to get credit for the very important work that they do, and therefore will be able to make it a priority. Before our deliverables, actions could be unnecessarily repeated because an item's history is unknown, but after, curation and analysis tasks are made much more efficient because you're not unnecessarily duplicating work. So feedback from the RDA community, we still would very much like to know if we're missing any overlap or collaboration within RDA. We are already aware of the metadata groups and the provenance groups and are moving forward with those collaborations. And like I said before, we come from the biodiversity space, so we want to make sure that we're not missing any disciplinary concerns. So feel free to review our use cases and let us know if we're just completely missing a concern from your discipline. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne. Now we're going to open up the floor to any questions from the audience. These can be directed in general to all the participants to the panel, or maybe you have something more specific regarding any of the recommendations. Okay, so in the meantime, while you work your way to the microphone, if you have any questions, I might proceed and ask our panelists some questions that we foreseen. Since there's been so much talk about sustainability, and of course the sustainability and growth of RDA, and the adoption, of course, is right at the core of that, since the results of the groups are one of the most valuable outputs of RDA. There is also such a difficulty in finding adopters. So we wanted to know from you guys which were the biggest challenges in finding adopters, and what would be an easy roadmap towards adoption from your perspectives. What were the biggest challenges in finding adopters, and if you have sort of a roadmap in mind for easing the adoption from your group's perspectives?
So to answer this for the collections working group, so I remember at the beginning of this group when we developed our case statement and we asked around and looked for use cases, there was quite a lot of interest. But well, let's just say that between then and today, also the development of the group has also led to some definite changes in understanding the whole topic, and particularly when I showed the requirements, also that matured. So I think one of the challenges is definitely actually being able to talk about even some early adoption despite these changes, and actually doing that while the working group is still trying to find its path to what the heart of its recommendation should be. I think that is a very great challenge. So my perspective on this particularly is that we would like to also encourage adoption from this point on, and also keep the group active for a couple of plenaries, because that is, I think, one of the most important ways to give feedback also to us as the original developers of the specification itself, just to see how it is used and whether we need to change something or clarify how it is used and so on.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else would like to add to that? Larry?
So in general, with both the working group I talked about and other efforts in RDA, my main perspective is that you have to be persistent and you have to be patient. If you look at the history of adoption of various technologies, a few of them explode, but in most cases there's actually a fair number of years between starting something and seeing it grow. And of course, many of our efforts here will die. That's to be expected. If they all succeed, we're not being ambitious enough. So it's a matter of patience and sustainability in terms of you have to keep at it one project at a time.
Okay, thank you. Each one of you has touched upon the sort of desired contributions from the community. Are there any specific profiles that you think are missing from our community? Do you have anything that you feel that during your work was missing from a contributor's profile? Let me put it that way. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, it's on. So from our side, we have spotted 3 different categories, and that actually spans the range from technologists to domain experts. So we would need the domain experts because they obviously can give us the use cases. And we can think about that ourselves, but then chances are that it's miles away from what people really want to do. And also they have the data. We may create software, but we don't have the data, so we are dependent on people who have amounts of data or know how to get them. Then, of course, they need to be stored somewhere. As I explained, we need data centers that are willing to support the initiative so that we can get this story rolling. Technologists, I believe, we have some on board, but that is something where always new perspectives could come in, so that we make sure that we cover all aspects. So those is kind of a triad. But let me also add something to your last question. I believe, or I perceive RDA and the plenaries very much as a forum for exchange. There might be other cases in working groups where really deep technical work is being done, but my personal experience is we all have our share and our full desktop at home, and it's hard to come home and continue work. I believe the best thing really is to find a group of interested parties that together go for some funded project, because then you have both the interest and also the pressure to do something, because then you have to report something to your funding agency. So ideally, I would see this as an opportunity where ideas sparkle off, where teams build, and these teams then go home, get funded projects, and come back with results. But that's my personal perception.
Well, thank you for that. We have a question from the audience, please.
Yes, I think it might be a question as well for Tobias as for David. I see an urgent need upcoming for doing, let's say, controlled or managed duplication or replication of records, most or in the best ways, spread over continents and legislations and so on. So do you see any role of your proposed standards or recommendations in this area?
So yes, I think that is one of the very good and, as you say, very much in the current time very actively sought use cases. Thinking about what the collection working group did and how the specification turned out to be, I can imagine very well that an automated replication system that has to deal with multiple storage locations distributed all across continents, that if you are building such a distributed system, then you could use the collection specification as the intermediate layer that deals with depositing and well, not depositing, but actually creating these overarching, well, I would just say collections, but think of it as a file system. In terms of directories and so on, to create that structure across the different replication locations, and then facilitate something like automated replication by agents that can actually interact with these API endpoints and say, look, I have a new object that is going to be replicated, and I put it in this location, and that should be added to some virtual object that describes that describes the various locations just mingled into one instance. So I think that can actually be a good case for the use of our specification. Yes, I think so.
Yeah, and from my side, I think some of the work that inspired the direction we chose to take in our group came out of some work that was happening in the Fedora community, which was addressing some of this need around being able to replicate digital objects, particularly out towards distributed digital preservation systems. And there's a number of these, North America and elsewhere, that support Bagot as a packaging format, and as well as the kind of profile that's associated with it to distinguish between how these different systems handle content. But I think it's quite a useful way to be able to store content in your own repository, but also replicate it out for some of these other use cases, particularly around digital preservation. And so I do think supporting Bagot and profiles is a good way to achieve that, because it does seem like that format is supported in a lot of these cases.
Okay. Thank you very much. There are no other questions from the audience. So another thing that we would have liked to touch upon with you would be the synergies between the different groups. You've mentioned, Chandler, the synergy with the DTR, and I think also Anne mentioned it. And of course, between the two data collections and the data registry interoperability, there are several lines of that connect the activities of the group. What would be your advice for the groups that are starting? How should they build these synergies, and is there anything that RDA can do to support this activity?
Okay, there we go. So at least from the registry's perspective, the materials registry's perspective, I think it's very useful to know about the activities of the other groups and to be thinking about where we can start to pull in some of those other approaches and technologies, especially as our own group matures. And so just the knowledge and having people participate sort of across groups, at least for us, is I think a really important part in bringing in some of the recommendations from the other groups.
It's a challenge, and it was one of the topics of the TAB chairs meeting on Monday. And the hope is that the organization itself, either some special project within RDA or the TAB, somehow gets more time, will help with that by looking for missing connections between groups. At the moment, it's a challenge to know what all the 70 or 80 groups are doing. None of us here probably know that at any level of detail. So it's something that we need to work on. And there's a lot of potential there, but it will require some effort.
So I think one observation I would make from experience from the various working groups that I've been chairing and being part of, I would say that it is very essential to think about these cross-group relations when you are actively developing a case statement. Because the further the group progresses, the harder it gets to actually make changes in that whole arrangement. So I guess if you end up at month 12 in your 18-month time frame, thinking about how you could actually connect to other groups in terms of adapting your own efforts to what the other groups do, it gets very hard to do that in the last 6 months. It is still valuable, of course, to interact with other groups, Ben, but it will not have that impact on your own group's work in terms of looking for changes, how you could incorporate some things from other groups at that point. So I would say the key element is to start early, and as Larry also said, to look for RDA support in doing that. And also look for what is actively being developed at that point in time, and also be part of other groups and see what's in there and try to grab it, and try to also interact with the other groups, of course.
Yeah, I agree that it's a challenge, and also that starting early is quite important. I actually find sessions like this quite useful, and I realize we're talking about things 12 months in, or even at the end of the process, but I'm hearing about some things that I didn't know about even from members of this panel. I find it quite useful. I realize we have many groups, and so I may be ignorant of other opportunities where this is happening, but even just hearing at the outset of a group a quick 10-minute presentation on, what they're up to and what they're doing. I think people absorb information in different ways, and for me that would be quite useful just to hear early on what a group is up to, so it might spark something in my thinking that, oh, that's related to some idea I had. But yeah.
Yes, so I want to agree with what's been said and just add on that it helps if you take some specific time to go through the program and just look at all the groups and specifically look for overlap so that you can attend those sessions early in the process. So maybe your first, second, or third plenary that your group is in existence, you can do that before you get worried primarily about completing all of your deliverables.
Yes, so go ahead. Sorry, Peter.
I'm going to follow that pattern that is being established, agreeing to everything that has been said so far and adding. We have a proliferation of groups, and it's indeed not easy to keep an overview. It might be good to have some central chart which relates all the working groups. Call it a mind map, call it some structural diagram or whatever. For example, what we are doing with the array database group is more cross-sectoral and technology-oriented. Others are more domain-oriented. Just some way to structure this big set of groups so that people can find that spot where they might fit in. Maybe that could help.
Yes, I'm sure our tab members here present will take your advice into consideration. So again, starting early since the time of the case statement is very useful, and I wanted to shift a little bit the discussion towards the adoption. Oh, yes, sorry, thank you. We have a question.
Yeah, I'm Rob Hoofd from the Dutch Tech Center for Life Sciences, part of the Elixir Bridging Interest Group. So I also think with David that this session is actually quite interesting to hear also before things are done what is achieved and what is in the process of being achieved. One of the other things that was discussed at the TAP Interest Group Working Group Leaders Meeting last Monday was that a lot of the documentation that is actually available about the groups is targeted towards the processes inside RDA and not towards the outside public. So it makes it very difficult to understand. Now, I am a domain scientist, and I'm not actually a manager by now, process manager, and definitely not an ICT specialist. And certain groups, the descriptions, even for me, are very hard to understand. A lot of the ICT the directed groups are using fairly abstract terminology that makes it fairly difficult for me to know what is going on until I actually see an example. So for each of the presentations here, starting with an example of what you want to achieve in layman's terms, would be very helpful for me, and I think also for other people outside RDA.
Yes. That's true, and that's basically the goal behind the adoption stories and implementation stories that you might have seen around. That is the hope, that we can provide some sort of examples coming from the different groups of how the different recommendations and outputs have been adopted and what were the lessons learned. So yes, hopefully we'll get there soon. Yes.
I like the idea, and I'm carrying that home to establish such an example. However, I have sort of a challenge, and maybe you can help me. If we do some cross-cutting technology, I'm using my own example again because I know that one best. Such data cubes appear in virtually all sciences. Now, if I pick one example, say from life science, then the earth science folks might say, that doesn't touch me. Now I cannot do examples for all the variety of things we have. So what should we do? Would it be okay for you, for example, from the life sciences, that we have an example that focuses on, say, astrophysics or earth sciences? Would that already be helpful? Okay, I see a nodding. I'm just reflecting into the audience.
Yes, thank you. We have another question.
I was just going to add on to that, even if on your website you had some tags next to the working groups, I mean, just kind of for dummies, array database assessment, this is for people dealing with really, really, really big data. Research data collections, this is not for people doing collection development. This is people interested in doing some kind of a syntactical organizing thing, because there's an awful lot of stuff there, and it doesn't really jump out at you immediately that this is where I need to go to dig further to even get to seeing the use case that, even if it's in a completely different discipline, would still give me an idea what's going on. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Any thoughts on that? Anything to add to that? Okay. Yes, Kevin? Don't run.
Really a follow-up, I think, on those usual points about what helps people consider adoption. I think one of the other barriers sometimes that people can find is trying to understand what the likely cost of adoption is going to be, or indeed, what skill sets, what technologies does my organization need in order to be able to make use of the outputs of a particular group. And I think that's clearer with the outputs of some group than others. So this is a combination, I think, of an appeal not just to you folks, but to other groups to try and make that clearer, but also an offer of help wearing my hat as the co-chair of the organizational assembly. I think that's one thing that we're keen to be able to help the groups do, is to try and quantify the cost of adoption for somebody who's not been directly involved in the development of something. So I'd be interested in your reaction to that.
I have a question for Kevin. Would that include the audience? I mean, how would you carry? So I tried to immediately do that in my head, and one of the branches I thought of right away, but who is this for? So it would be, you're talking about cost of adoption, but also who is it for? Is that right?
So I think others have made that point of view. Who is this for? And I think that's to the extent that you can describe that's useful. But I know, I mean, just trying to think in the context of my own university, if I were trying to persuade the people, let's say, managing the research data repositories that one or the other outputs of your groups would be useful and they ought to consider it, one of the first questions they might be asking me is, well, what do we need and how much is it going to take? And I think that's not always clear from the group's outputs.
Yeah, and on that point, I think we were very cognizant of this sort of the cost of adoption when we were thinking through, do we want to specify an API? Do we want to base our work on, existing standards and technologies? What's sort of a lowest common denominator application that might be broadly applicable? And in one of our discussions, we were bringing in representatives from of people that are developing repositories to vet this approach with them. And one of the reasons we were so interested in something like Bagot, for example, is that it is fairly widely adopted amongst a lot of different systems, and even those that don't use it, it's relatively easy to just put export content into a package. And so that's that won't apply in every case, but just I know for us a big focus was trying to think about what is going to be broadly adoptable, and even if some other solution might be potentially even better down the road, if it had a really high cost early adoption, that might be a big barrier towards actually producing something useful. So it's sort of there was a big factor. We didn't, in our thinking, it was certainly the cost of adoption was a major factor there.
From my perspective, I actually see this as kind of an opportunity for the different types of groups that are more domain focused, maybe versus more infrastructurally focused, to say have a domain working group look to adopt some of the more infrastructural outputs as a way to essentially identify where there may be challenges in broader adoption, for example, and to work closely to try to do that intentionally, and that might help identify some of these issues of what kinds of resources would be required that may not have been identified yet.
So, given what we also talked earlier about related to work across groups or dependency between groups, this to me then raises a concern and a risk, because if, for example, we in the research data collections working group would have said, okay, you have to use PIDs and you have to use the data type registry, that immediately increases the costs. So at some point, I guess a group has to decide whether it's useful enough to mandate some use of another working group's output just for the purpose of having it there. Then that's very tricky, and so I don't have a good answer to how to resolve that conflict, other than saying, look, every recommendation should be able to stand on its own to reduce this risk of increased adoption costs, but also offer these extension points. Now, developing something against those requirements to satisfy both, I think is quite a lot to ask from groups, but it might just be the best case to do here.
So I'll just add that you really need to, I guess, pitch to the decision maker when you're trying to get someone to adopt your recommendations, or an institution or whatever organization. And that decision maker may not be the person or the people who are going to be directly touched by the problems that you're solving. So the decision maker has their own perception of what the costs and benefits are. So you have to pitch to the right person, and then you have to pitch it such that the benefits outweigh the costs, right? And you also may need to find out who can influence that decision maker if they're not on the same page or not where you need them to be to see that the benefits outweigh the costs.
Okay, thank you. We have another question?
Yeah, I just wanted to let everybody that is interested in this question of how to kind of decide which adoptables to go with and what that process might be like, and looking at the costs and benefits, know that the next session at 11 o'clock, we are hosting a Birds of the Feather session on adopting RDA products. And so this is a round table, so people that have adopted products from the RDA can kind of tell some stories about what that was like, and those that are considering it. We're going to start with a framing where we offer quite a few questions that might be useful to ask yourselves about whether or not this is an adoptable for you. So we're in Mansfield 8 in the next session.
Thank you very much. That's very useful. I'm sure you'll be able to answer some of the questions that have been raised and which are on the mind of many RDA members. Okay, so I just had a final question, which was a personal curiosity of mine. If you think of the list of adopters that you've initially identified in your case statement, how many of those have actually become adopters at this stage of your recommendations, and what were sort of the advantages that had led you to that successful story? Are there any lessons to be learned from that?
Yeah, talk to them ahead of time. So in our case, it was most of them, but because they were sort of in on it. And so it was a group of people who decided they needed this. We didn't just try and make it up out of the blue and force it on people.
Yeah, I think the story was similar for us. The work largely came out of a need. There were numerous kind of discussions amongst stakeholders here at RDA and elsewhere that this is a problem that we wanted to tackle and try to solve. And so already when we sort of initially formed the group, we had people that were interested in working on this problem because it was something that was applicable to their to their work. And so I think that helped a lot. We're not at a state yet where our output is really adoptable, so it's yet to be seen how that works out in the end. But so far we've had very good kind of engagement from the people that are interested in this, and that they have signaled that they do want to adopt this. So yeah.
Okay, so if there are no other questions from the audience, we thank very much all our panelists. I thank you all for taking part in our plenary session. Yes, and coffee is in the foyer on the 3rd level.